Why don't you start by telling me what was going on in your life before you went overseas, before you volunteered? Just sort of set the scene. What were you doing?
Well, I joined the reserves in a student summer employment program in '73, it would have been. And I finished up grade 11, grade 12, and was a member of the South Alberta Light Horse. And then was applied for the RCMP and were accepted, and then put on a waiting list for a depot date. So I worked any job I could find, and at the time we were putting in for call-outs with, there was requests came for reservists to go to call-outs, and we would take and go, there was a small cadre of us, would go away and do whatever. So we had a couple of good opportunities. We went and worked with the Reg Force, mostly C Squadron Strathcona, because we'd trained on the ferrets and were ferret drivers. And we had a chance to go work with them several different times as they were short ferret drivers. We did wheel driver training with the Strathconas. So Army-wise, we were pretty well trained up. And then opportunities came to do flyover training in Germany with the RCDs. So again, the basic small cadre of that. And our RSS at the time had us really well trained up to the level that they wanted. And so we got a chance to go over to Germany. And then we came back and we're back with the Strathconas again pretty much instantly, and that was when the opportunity to go to Egypt came up.
Tell me about that. How did that roll out?
Well, I was working as a ferret driver, and it's hard to say what's truth and what's rumor when you're deployed as a 19-year-old trooper, but it basically came out that none of the Strathconas wanted to go because they'd already done several tours over there, and the joke was around that we were going to go. Be Corporal Symington and myself that were working with them. And we said, oh yeah, sure. And we'd been discussing back home, saying any deployments like that came up, we'd be more than glad to go. And then I got a message out in the field that when we were done there, we were to report to Calgary for our training before we went overseas on it. So it was sort of a surprise, but it's hard to say whether the paperwork was all done here by our RSS or whether the paperwork was done through the unit that we were with in Calgary.
At that time in the late 70s, how rare was it for reservists to go on an overseas tour that wasn't going to Germany?
It was totally rare. I believe here we'd had maybe 2 members go to flyover training. It was all brand new to our organization here, to the best of my knowledge, and it was definitely pretty much brand new to the units that we went to work with reservists too. I know there'd been flyovers of whole units and stuff before us for reforgers and stuff, but for us to go over and augment them in the roles that we were doing, some of our reconnaissance people went right into the Lynx troops and were working on it. I ended up in more of a GD role that I was there.
So what did how old were you at the time, and what did your family and friends say when you said, I'm going to Egypt?
When I went to Egypt, I would have been 1976, June. I would have just turned 20. And coming from a military family, it wasn't that big a deal on it. For my parents were both military. And I'd been in the reserves and been away. Like I said, I'd already missed Christmases and stuff on deployments. So it wasn't that big a deal. My friends, especially here, everybody in the unit was really excited and glad that we were going. And my friends, I had very few because we moved so much in the military. So this was my dad's final posting. So I basically parachuted in right at the end of high school and didn't really have a lot of friends that way. Just my friends were all in the unit here.
So what did you do for your workup training to prepare yourself?
Our workup training was surprising. We got shipped to Calgary from Wainwright, and then we went back into a bunch of military training, which we had just been doing for months. So marksmanship, rifles, grenades, dig and slit trenches, all the military training that would be involved, and we'd just been doing it with C Squadron, LDSH, and that's who was tasked with rotoing into Egypt, and that's who we were going with. So it was pretty funny that the day that we showed up, there was 11 of us in the cadre that was going, and of that 11, about 6 of us had been deployed together either in Germany or at other various call-outs and workups. And so we knew each other, and then not only that, when we lined up in the morning, we knew all the instructors, and the instructors knew all of us. It was a very small group that was working, basically a Class B call-out pretty much full-time. We were being reservists.
Just so I can be clear, so all of C Squadron, you're augmenting C Squadron and they're going over as a squadron. Is that how it was?
No, I don't think it was the whole squadron, but there was an awful lot of members that, as I understand, were moving at the same time. So we were going over there, it wasn't as an armored squadron, it was just replacing bodies in various positions throughout. And I know that there was a lot of members from that squadron that ended up over there. I didn't end up with the Canadians, I ended up in an out detachment. So,
What was the mix on your mission between regulars and reserves, and how were reserves or militia at the time treated?
Flying over, the flight was a disaster in that we were in our heavy green dress uniform. We get to Cairo and it's hundreds of degrees in the shade, the windows are shut, there's no air conditioning, we're left on the bus forever. We'd had a long night's stay over in Lahr, where basically nobody went to sleep on it, but we got a chance to visit our friends that were there. So we got to Cairo, and then it was forever on the tarmac, and then we finally got on buses that weren't air conditioned. We're in a green winter uniform because it was fall when we were leaving. And then we basically got to Ismailia, where the contingent was, and off a bus and on to parade, and everybody was sick from the heat and the travel and everything. So our initial few days were pretty rough on the body on it, for sure. On it. As a mix of reservists and regular force, there was probably the 11 of us reservists, and then the rest of the aircraft was all regular Army from various units.
So how did that pan out, your working relationships between regs and reserve?
To start with, there was, once you got there and they issued you this Pakistani bush uniform and that, nobody could really tell who was reservists and who was regular force, so that part got sorted out. But ours, because we were replacing, I think it was 5 Brigade, it was Franco units, there was problems on it between the people we were replacing and us coming in on it. That there was a cultural or a military problem. I don't know how you would word it, but there was some back and forth and stuff. So I ended up posted out of Ismailia within the first couple of weeks and was sent to a movement control det in the port city of Alexandria, Egypt on it. So there was 11 of us. So there was 3 reservists, and we were on like a general duty. We were drivers, bodyguards. We guarded a warehouse at night. Like we had 3 jobs between the 3 of us, and it was quite a lot of work, very few days off net. But in that detachment, we also had 3 signalmen, which we didn't really get to see very much. They were all just secretive to themselves. We had 3 movement control members, and then we had 3 military police. One was a Canadian military policeman, then the other 2 were, one was a Finn and one was a Swede military policeman. So we were an 11-man detachment, several hundred miles away from the rest of the Canadians on it.
Can we just take a step back? Before you went over there, what were you expecting it to be like?
I expected to be a guard or something like that, like, because we were, face it, we were soldiers. We'd been training pretty hard and heavy, and as reconnaissance soldiers, that's basically what I expected to be. Was in the GD platoon as a guard, and that's where I was slated to be when I got there. But again, being an Anglo and not speaking French, and the whole guard platoon was all French at the time, I got shipped out. As some of these other 11, most of them got shipped out to other detachments. We were the advance party the first of the people that were going in to change out the contingent. I didn't last 2 weeks. I was gone in a little over a week. I had a sergeant. My uncle was a sergeant in charge of the SIGS detachment that was there. So realistically, I got a real plum job of probably the best job there was over there. Ended up falling in my lap.
So just sticking with your expectations, though, those are your expectations. What did you hope for yourself? What did you want to get out of this experience?
When we'd been in Germany, I'd got on holidays. I was the big part in Germany. We got to travel to get on the train and just travel across Europe and see stuff that I'd seen as a child when my parents were deployed there. I wanted to see it as adults. So castles in the Rhine and Amsterdam and Denmark and stuff. So in Egypt, I wanted to see the local tourist stuff. I was quite interested in the area in the desert where the Israelis and the being armored, and it had been such an armored battle. It's quite interesting seeing the ground, seeing the terrain on it, and I'd also want to see the pyramids and the tourist stuff. So basically, it was just a keen young soldier wanting to call out, and this came up, and it was an adventure of a lifetime.
Sounds almost like a little bit of military tourism. Is that what you?
I think that was sort of part of it. Yeah, I was glad to be going with my friends on it, which was a big issue because we were a very tight group, especially after our training beforehand. Every day running in the mornings, working constantly, doing it. And these were all senior reservists, or militiamen at the time. I was the only trooper. Everybody else were corporals. They would have been master corporals, sergeants, warrant officers, but everybody dropped down to corporal to go over. So we even had, I know a couple of them were sergeants that went down to corporal, and one, I believe he was a Rocky Mountain Ranger, had either been a warrant officer or a sergeant major, and he'd went back down to corporal because they all deployed as corporals and myself on it.
Can you talk a little bit about that? Because I'm assuming that was not their choice, but that was the only way as a reservist you could.
That was the only way as a reservist they could go. And interestingly, some of them as we were deployed over there, especially the Rocky Mountain Ranger, that was a senior NCO, when I went back, occasionally I would get a chance to get back to where the Ismailia, where the Canadians were. And I'd go back, and this individual, Stu, I'll call him, he would be a master corporal, and then next he was a sergeant. And then when I saw him in the desert, he was the one-man detachment at El Arish, where the gas station was, right in between Israel and Egypt, and he was back as a warrant officer again. So, but the way they were getting around that, it was well-so employed ranks on it. But it was quite, and he was a very good senior NCO, even in our training running up to it. And face it, you've got corporals and master corporals doing this training, and they knew he was a senior NCO. There was no doubt. So that was tourism, yes, but no, because it was all, for the first 3-4 months, letters home, it was just straight work. There was no time for travel. There was no time. We were worked every day. We'd guard every third night. We would sleep in a warehouse as a sovereignty thing and all that. But then I got a chance to go on my 2 weeks off, and I had a chance to fly. You couldn't fly directly between the two countries then, so you had to go back to Ismailia, fly to Cyprus, spend a night in Cyprus, and then you could fly into Jerusalem. And then I spent 2 weeks in Jerusalem in the Holy Land. And then it was an amazing, as a young 19, 20-year-old from southeastern Alberta, I met film crews from Alberta that were filming documentaries there, and jokes about coming from southeastern Alberta, wearing a Sally horse jacket to actually have somebody understand what SALH meant on the back was a surprise in a crowd, and then meeting with them. So then coming from there, twin otters flying back and forth, so like small aircraft. We had engine problems and then sort of landed hardly in a military runway just short of Tel Aviv. So needless to say, my travel arrangements back were a little skewed. I got down to where the Canadians were in Tel Aviv and got asked if I could drive a deuce and a half, and I said sure. They said, well, in a couple of days, then I'd be going on a convoy back because the aircraft had to await parts. So I actually got to drive right from Tel Aviv straight through, and then when they swung the bridge across the canal every night. And there was only certain hours you could cross the Suez Canal. There was no bridges, just a swinging, floating bridge thing. So I actually got to drive across the desert with a convoy too, and got to see a lot of the stuff I wanted.
Yeah,
So,
what was it like in terms of like the debris and things like that?
well, actually on the Israeli side, it looked just like west of Medicine Hat here. It's all irrigation and lush and green, and when you hit the border, it was like 3 strands of barbed wire and then bare, desolate, third world country. Just a desert. So irrigation and people on one side, and then just relics and debris and that till we got to where the battalions were. We had Finbats from Finland, Sweden, and Poland were the battalions that were in the desert on it. And in the movement control that we were supporting all the stuff that come in from the ships and went through the port. So I got to do holidays that way for a couple of weeks, and then when I finally got back to our detachment, because our replacements were coming in early, and there was like 3 people in to replace me and our OIC. Our officer was a Danish field service officer. He wasn't a soldier. He was a UN officer, and we had a warrant officer. Had a warrant officer movement control, then a sergeant movement control, and a master corporal movement control on it. So our Danish field service officer, he sat through about 11 wars with the UN. He was really calm, cool. And when I came back, I explained why I was late and was welcomed back into the fold, because they were sort of, I was a young soldier, and I was away from where I was supposed to be. So they knew about it right away, because everybody knowing that aircraft had landed so hard on it. It was instantly the signalman no back and forth over there. So I ended up getting back, and then they pretty much just said I could have a couple more weeks off, and I had a Passat car and gas coupons, and I had a few tasks I had to do, but I got another couple of weeks to travel around Egypt, because I'd been there, at that time I'd been there for just about 5 months, and I hadn't been to Cairo, I hadn't seen the pyramids, I hadn't done any of the thing that the normal people that were back working with the Canadians, they would get weekends and they would get days here and there that they could go to Cairo, and in Alexandria we hadn't got any of that. So, but then I sort of got spared up at the end. So not only that, we were having tourists come in. We'd have a couple of very senior padres from the Canadian Armed Forces wanted to go see Alamein and the graveyards there. And our boss said, Private Gradwell the warrant officer said, would you be interested in driving these guys out there and doing that? And I said, sure. So we got 2 of the Jeeps. We left their station wagon and air conditioning and got 2 of the Jeeps kitted out with extra fuel and stuff, and went out to Alamein and toured the Commonwealth graveyards and some of the beaches and areas out there. So that was very exciting. That was something I know. Apparently I have a relative buried there, but I didn't know the name. I asked my uncle when I got back, and he told me the name was, but I would have never found it on my own. So in a nutshell, what was it like? It was real hard work, like day in, day out for months on end, with very few breaks. And then at the end I had, basically, my holiday time was a great, tremendous holiday on it. And then to come back into the real world.
But you said you got this plum job, but what made it a plum job if it's so hard?
Well, because we were in Alexandria, we were, like I said, it was an 11-man detachment. So I had never worked, our warrant officer was a senior Navy man, the sergeant was Air Force, the master corporal was Air Force, the master corporal MP was Air Force. So except for us 3 reservists, there was no Army people there, and we were used to the yes or no sir and tough old warrant officers and a lot of stuff, and it wasn't that. It was like a big family. It was family meals. It was Friday night cards together. it was incredible. And the work that we were doing, especially one of our major 3 roles were to accompany the movement control guy that was taking money into the port. Basically at the time, nothing come in the port without money exchanging hands on it. So several times a week, the Master Corporal MP would escort the corporal down to a big bank, and they would get 100,000 American dollars. And then we would drive them around the port, and he would pay off stevedores to unload the ships, truckers to go. So it was bakshish, they called it. It was bribing everybody. Or your boats went to the back of the line on it. And that was, so we were driving every day and into the port every day. So you got to see stuff. And some of the stuff was amazing. I got to go on an American aircraft carrier, the USS Incheon. It was a helicopter assault ship at the time on it. I got to go on there and got a tour of the ship. They checked us out pretty good when we went up, and then they give us some Marines to show us around the ship. And then we went back the next night with a couple of Jeeps, brought them to the villa where we were living, and played volleyball, and then took them out on a night on the town. We got to go on a British HMS Norfolk, a guided missile cruiser. It's a little tougher getting on that. But again, bold as brass, walk up the gangway. We had a little different uniform than the rest of the Canadians. Our Danish field service officer, he thought this Pakistani bush uniform that we were wearing, it was a olive drab, utilitarian, really, didn't fit our role. So basically we ended up wearing work dress pants, work dress boots, and the green CF shirt, short sleeve, with an epaulets saying UN and Canada on it. And we basically, unless we were working on something really dirty, then we'd wear combat clothing on it. So we, the first couple of times we went back to Himalaya, we really heard about it from RSMs and that, because our uniform wasn't the standard that was the Canadians. But then again, we were in a huge city of millions of people, and there was lots of different soldiers around. So we wore a little different uniform than everybody else was wearing at the time.
It occurs to me, because it's not a well-known mission now, can you just give me a little bit of the broader context? What was the role of the mission at the time?
The role of the mission for CanLog was the Canadian Logistics Group that was in Himalaya, was to support the battalions in the desert. And there was a Finnish battalion, a Swedish battalion, and a Polish battalion. And they were stuck, again, like tripwire diplomacy, they were stuck in between the Israelis and the Arabs, or the Egyptians on it. So basically Canada, our movement controlled that. All the stuff that come in through the ships came to Alexandria, and then we got it off onto civilian contractor trucks and that, and then shipped to Himalaya, is what our role was with the movement controlled that. The 3 reservists, myself included, were, again, general duties. We were drivers, we were bodyguards, we were handymen, we were mechanics, we were everything that light armored troopers can do on it, but working for Air Force and Navy people on it. So there was quite a bit of culture shock that way. Now, the Canadian contingent, back where they were, they had signals groups set up out to the desert. There was a huge signals thing. They run a switchboard downtown. There were big supply functions. There was a Air Force contingent that flew these Fokker aircraft back and forth on it. So I didn't get to spend a lot of time back. When I did get a chance to go back and visit, I would either scam a ride with the DR, the dispatch riders that would come up once a week. I would scam a ride back with them, and especially if I knew there was another one coming right back. And so I did get back a couple of times to visit my friends. And I did, when the other Sally Horse member was injured was shot, and that I did get, basically then the Army brought me back to see my friend that was hurt.
What happened with him?
It was a guard accident at night. I'm not too sure, because everything come down and then he was gone. But it was a guard. Our rules of engagement were you were supposed to have your magazine in your pocket, buttoned down, you couldn't engage anybody until they shot at you. That was our rules. And then somehow in this guard accident in the middle of the night, one guard shot another. So it was an accidental discharge, but he should have never had it loaded. So I'm not too sure what happened.
You told me about a couple of other incidents. Is there another that stands out in your memory?
Working the port and then ending up my career as a first responder and a medical person and firefighter. The very first person I probably saw get killed was in the port. And at the time, basically, it's training while you're there, but if you drive over a cow, you want to just keep on going because they're going to sue you for the value of the cow forever, and that's up. But in this case, I actually saw an accident where in Canada we would, as a young trooper, you would just grab your first aid kit and rush over there and do the ABCs and all start. And in this case, a master warrant officer MP that was with me, he drove it the other way and said, no, we can't get involved, they'll sue us, and then everything. And the injuries that this individual, crush injuries that he had, he probably passed away. But again, it was so foreign for me not to rush to the injury and help out, because all our training before that is just massive first aid all the time. We're in Germany and all the time everything, and just our standard SOPs and that. And in this case, this master warrant officer, Finn, just turned left and drove the other way and said, no, you're not going. It was interesting with them too. They're military policemen in their army are civilian policemen that are reservists. And when they went overseas there, if they stayed from one tour to another, they got promoted. So some of these, the Finns and the Swedes, some of them had been there several years already. And this one master warrant officer in this detachment had been there over a year. So he very knew all the locals, all the people, and that knew all the customs.
I just wanted to be clear, you didn't cause, your vehicle didn't cause this accident?
No.
You just happened to...
We were just happened to drive towards, it was a forklift that they were changing a tire on, and a vehicle, it was insecured, it was just basically up on a rock, and then a vehicle drove in the other side of it, and it come over and crushed this individual on it. And it was a young lad, and it's probably the first person I'd seen killed on it.
So what did you think at the time as the young Canadian driving away from it?
Wrong. Like, I thought it was wrong. I didn't, I couldn't understand that, like, who cares if they sue you or whatever, you're just gonna try and do good. Thinking back on it, there's nothing we could have done for the injuries anyways, but just instant at the time, I thought we should be going and we should be helping. But again, I wasn't driving, the master warrant officer was driving actually. I had no chance. He didn't even stop. And there was several different things in the port that it was a dangerous place on it, and there was accidents and incidents that went on. Not too much for us. Like we stood out. Like we had white Jeeps, like I said, pretty much a dress uniform, a blue beret. So we really stood out, and we were there every day on it. And they knew we were there supporting this movement control guy with the money. So we were very well known to all the ports, the authorities, and all the security that were there.
Ultimately, how satisfying was this tour for you as a young man?
Oh, it was amazing. It was a life-altering event on it to see what I saw, and actually one of the biggest things on my bucket list is to get back and see it again with my wife. But again, when I retired, that's when the upheavals were going on again on it. And I'm sure you can never go back. Like, I know myself, I would be on the lookout when I was driving. I would be lookout for remnants of the war. Their last war was just before this mission, so it was relatively recent. And there would be bragging by the Egyptians on where they stopped the Israelis, and then on the outskirts of Cairo at the end of the airport there'd be an M48 American tank with a big bullet hole through the side of it. So the Israelis went a lot farther than the Arabs wanted to let on. They just stopped at the edge of Cairo, because what are you going to do with like 6 million people So it was quite interesting. And again, like I said, when I got to drive through the desert to Nalarish, and then through the different the passes and stuff where the battles went, it was having read it up on it in school and studied it as a young soldier, armored soldier, this big battle. It was quite interesting to see on it. That was all before we had these TV and the documentary shows and all the stuff we had, so it was pretty neat.
What about your dealings with the Egyptians or the Israelis? Any memories that way?
The Israelis, like I said, I was mostly on holiday, so I was a tourist there. So the Israelis were very efficient. When the aircraft came down, the soldiers were extremely efficient. They wanted the film out of my camera and everything, just in case I had taken any pictures coming down in the aircraft. And of course I had on it. And because we landed in a military installation, the young officer that came on spoke perfect English. And he said, you can give me the film or I can take the film out. Either way, I don't care, he said. And it was neat. The Israelis were extremely modern, extremely friendly and all that. The Egyptians, especially traveling between Ismailia and Alexandria, it was definitely the poorest. Even the Delta, it's rich land, but the people were so poor, and they would be digging irrigation canals with a shovel and like 20 men, and just right back into the Stone Age in parts. Then you get to the city, and while it's Alexandria is a huge city with millions of people, it's basically built, their apartment buildings would have one stick of rebar and then like a mud type concrete, and they would build these 10-story apartment buildings. And then like every once in a while one of them would fall down, or you'd have an earthquake and they'd all fall down. Well, they're building codes and building construction, there's no such thing. And the traffic was just bizarre. All little Fiat cars and driving in the traffic. That's something, because we drove every day through the city, and face it, we're from Medicine Hat. Even though we'd had training in Calgary and we'd all done our 404s, and we had 404s for everything that they had over there, when it actually comes down that you have to drive in a big city like that, and usually alone or with a tourist, like someone coming to the detachment that wasn't from there. Very seldom did two of us. We were too short manpower for two of us, so usually we were driving somebody else and we were going back and forth. And we had a lot of visitors too. The detachment was a good place to go visit for those that could get time. And several of my friends that from the small cadre, from the BCDs and that, did get up. As they were working as signalmen, they did get up to relieve our signalmen when they went on holidays and that. So we did get to visit a little bit.
Tell me about how you, in the day, how you would come home from this mission.
It was absolutely bizarre. We basically got back to Ismailia. You turned in your kit that you had that was going. You did up your barrack box, flew to Germany, flew to St. Hubert. Well, flew to Ottawa, got sent to St. Hubert. You were there for 4 or 5 days medical, and then you were flown home to Medicine Hat, and out the door you were. I got in on a Wednesday night and drove down to the armories to see my friends and see the unit. Actually met the girl I married one night back in Canada.
You met her that night?
I met her that night. I deployed with her brother and that, but she's younger, so I just didn't know her as a little kid, and we're still married today, 39 years later. So
it was quite the night, apparently.
It was pretty good. Went to A&W, run out of gas, my dad's car that I'd borrowed, and got rescued, and it's quite the story on it. So
what was it like just making that transition from a major mass, well, just everything you've described culturally, going from that to this?
Well, especially coming back to 40 below was a culture shock, and then not working every day and having to find a job, and it was incredibly strange. It was really, really strange, because they're, like I said, even as a private, we had the best food and drink, and we had a beautiful villa we were living in. It was walled and guarded by Arabs, actually by Egyptians on it. And we working, like I said, in the port. There'd be cruise liners there one day, there'd be Russian submarines the next. There was all sorts of, after being in Germany, like anytime you saw something Russian, in Germany you had to write down and make reports and that. And over there we would report it, and then a day or two later somebody would show up to think about it or look about it. But again, the cone of silence would come down, and a lowly private like me wasn't involved with it, except I would drive them around the port and show them what we saw. And then these nondescript, they were military policemen, but they weren't military policemen. They were something else in the hierarchy. And they were quite interested in any time that the Russians were in the port.
So how long do you think it took you to basically find your groove back here in Canada after coming home?
Well, we got back the end of February, and I would say probably this summertime, because then we went to a milcon in, so we got back in the unit, trained steady to get back up, get a reconnaissance troop together and send to Shiloh. So, and then it was just right back into the reserve, basically full-time reserve role for a bit on it. And then I started getting promoted because I'd been in an awful long time to still be a trooper. I just had missed the odd course here and there because I'd been deployed. So I was way behind the curve in getting promoted. So then I got promoted really quick, especially in that Hellier period. It was like pretty much an instant master corporal on it. So, and then senior NCO courses and stuff like that. So it was pretty steady. And I would take any security job or anything back here because, again, I was still waiting to go in the RCMP. All I needed was a depot date from the Mounties, and I was gone. So this was a perfect fit for me. The reserve life and job and working another job, it was a good fit for me.
As you look back at it now, how do you think that experience changed you, affected you as a person and as a soldier?
As a soldier, and probably eventually why I got out of the unit on it, we constantly kept training up to put these reconnaissance troop, be it 5 vehicles or 7 vehicles, be it 10 or 21 men. We kept doing this light reconnaissance training, and we kept training up these in a constant cycle and that. And then every time we deployed, we were never used as reconnaissance soldiers. Even when we went to a reconnaissance regiment, we would be an enemy or we would be a bad guy or something. So that got, even my last major deployment was back up to Wainwright with C Squadron Strathcona as a master corporal. And I was basically the troop sergeant. And we spent several months out in the wintertime in Ferret scout cars. And at the end of the exercise, the lieutenant, I asked him why we were doing this, because it was real bitter conditions on it and really tough. And our drivers were all from like Nova Scotia and Newfoundland. Just the troop warrant and myself were the only basically Albertans or Westerners. And I asked the young lieutenant why we were doing it, and he said just to prove we could. And that was probably the wrong thing at the time for me on it. So that part didn't work out good. But I happened to find a job that was very comparable, and I went into firefighting on it. So all my skills, all my communication skills, my map reading, all my reconnaissance skills, and I was working for Department of National Defense. So all my leadership training, junior NCO courses, senior NCO courses, things like that in the public service had value. So it was for starting a 35-year career as a fire officer in the Department of National Defense, it was an excellent base and an excellent grounding. It did me well.
Is there anything that I haven't asked you about your experience that you want to finish on?
It was an amazing time. I wish I had kept a journal. Like I've thought more of this the last day since I knew this was coming, and I can remember names like the Warrant Officer Tomanchek, Sergeant Murphy, Master Corporal Bergeron, but I couldn't remember their names. Even on the plaques on the wall in my my Love Me wall at home. Can't read their signatures. I wish I had kept a journal. I wish I had have probably not drank as much as we did, because drinking was a very social thing in the military at that time, in the early 70s. Drinking was a lot. And I wish I had done more on it, like more. It would have been hard on the traveling, but I could have done probably more on it. So, and there's a few other, just the general working between the reserves and the reg force. At different times through my career, yes, there was definite problems that people would look down as reservists, as militiamen at the time on it. But usually once we got into a unit, I was with A Squadron RCDs in Germany. And once you got into there and into the tank or working, and the people saw that you knew what you were doing, the reservist part of it pretty much went out the window right away. It was all, we were very highly trained by our RSS staff here, Cap McDonald and Captain Purdy and Warrant Harris. The people that left here on tours and detachments were very, very well trained military-wise. And basically it was, we were well coached on it. And with CFB Suffield being here and being on exercise and going on exercise and working with Regi Force troops and range control and taskings and stuff. So we were ready for, not problems, but we were ready for issues. And that we probably had more issues reservist against reservist than we had reservist against Reg Force, if the truth be known. And there was a lot of issues between the French people from some of the Quebec units and our units. It seemed to constantly, wherever we went, in Germany we had issues, and in the Middle East we had issues on it. So it just was a thing of the time, I think.
When you say reservist on reservist, do you mean sort of regiment versus regiment? Is that?
Not really. No, it would be Anglo versus Franco.
Okay.
On it, and usually somebody would say something stupid or do something stupid, and then it would escalate on it. And it was not, it would be nobody, from that era, it would be to nobody's surprise that I'm saying that there was problems, because there was on it. Overall, the reserves and the South Alberta Light Horse was an excellent for me. Reason I finally quit was I had a wife and young children, and the commitment to being a shift worker it just eventually got too much. Couldn't handle it. I know some, especially some that went up through the senior officers, did do it, but with a wife and young children, I couldn't keep it up on it. So eventually, work and family on it. I later on came back with the CIC and again got commissioned as a cadet instructor, and that was a good time. And my son went through the whole cadet program on it, so I got to come back into basically the regimental fold and help out. And I still have some very good friends and neighbors today from the time when I was in the militia, and my wife was in the militia also. So it's a small, was at the time, this was the edge of town, and you know you're in the middle of the city now. We shot right here with machine guns just outside that window into butts. So times have really changed on it. That was the other thing that was amazing when we got to Egypt. The regular force weren't ready for the equipment. There was like 1958 Jeeps and early pattern Jeeps, and that coming from the reserves, that's what we used. And we were quite familiar with all of them. And we could keep them going and work well with them, where they were used to all brand new equipment and stuff. So it was, and we had driver's licenses. Most of, like, we could drive anything in the fleet. By the time you finished, we'd go back for one day, or before you got out to the out detachments, we'd go through transport. You'd be tested on every vehicle they had in the fleet. And as part of the training going when we were in Calgary, where we were driving downtown Calgary in deuce and a halfs and multi-fuelers on it, and down to Colonel Belcher Hospital, and towing water buffaloes and trailers around and like through the city in Calgary. And we all ended up with our 404s with everything they had. And then that was one of the reasons we got the one Master Corporal posted in, couldn't drive any of the equipment we had on it. Whatever his job in the Air Force didn't require him to drive. So it was quite something. Or he'd lost his license, I don't know which. So.
That's great. Thanks very much.
Well, I thank you, sir. It was fun. Like I said, I've thought more of it in the last couple of days than I have in years and years. Things I wish I'd done, I wish I had wrote in for the medal and got the other medal you can get for it. And I wish I had kept a journal, big time. It would be nice to touch base with some of the people, see if they're still alive, see what they're going. And just basically just reminisce and go with it. You see, because it's an old mission now, there's very few left around, but on November 11th, for example, we'll get in Redcliffe and there'll be 7 or 8 different members that'll have been with UNF2. So the first thing you say, when were you there? And there's been a couple that we just overlapped a little bit, but because I was away on it, as soon as you say I was in Alex, they said, oh no, we never got there on it. But they were back with the contingent and they were there. That was the other thing too. Whenever I went back with them, because we lived it was in a villa, so it was a very nice area, walled, like a nice building on it, but it had no air conditioning. And the Canadians at Ismailia, by then, they were getting air-conditioned trailers and stuff like that. As it went on year after year, they were getting pretty snazzy rooms and stuff. And the first time I went back and slept in air conditioning, I got so sick. And the water was bleached. Basically all our drinking water was bleached because we didn't have the state-of-the-art bottle-making water equipment. It was water buffaloes full of the best the Egyptians could give you, and then they bleached it. So that made a lot of people sick. And the smells, that's the stuff I remember, is the smells every morning. Untanned leather, sewage. It's open sewers running around our compounds and things like that. So it was an awesome experience. And like I said, it was life-altering for me. So.
Thanks.
Thanks, boss.